I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm going to be responding to a Russell Brand interview of Sebastian Junger called Individuality versus Our Need for One Another. Today is also Halloween, and I don't have enough time to change my spots in between my morning dance class and my evening dance party. Nor do I have enough cheetah tattoos, as Russell so charmingly calls them. Now, you're going to today not only have the challenge of taking a woman seriously who's talking about economics, politics, and religion, but taking seriously a woman with cheetah spots on her face. Good luck with that. While we're talking about tattoos, Russell released a video talking about his called I Am Not a Member of the Illuminati. Methinks the man protests too much, but I want to point out that on the cover of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, that very symbol that he has tattooed on him is one that I am kicking off of the hierarchy. So take that. So I'm calling my episode Interdependence versus Interbeing. Interdependence is something where we cooperate because we need each other, because we think that's going to be good for our own survival. Interbeing is a concept that, or a word that was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, where he is looking at us being one, where our intercooperation is not something that we're doing for the survival of our ego self. It's something that we're doing in response to our true self. And so in looking at that, I want to agree heartily with Sebastian on the three things that he looks at as solutions to our current dilemma. The first one is localism. And his examples of how smaller is better is something that I talk about extensively in my book. One of the people I quote is Johan Galtung, who is the founder of Peace and Conflict Studies, who negotiated with Afghanistan and compared it to Switzerland and said it was the graveyard of empires because you had to defeat every separate little canton or clan, and that made it much more resilient. So what I say is that bigger is better for empire, but smaller supports sovereignty. The second thing he looks at is removing contempt. I'd say a step further, and I say that we need to remove any sense of our own superiority. In my episode Alien Nation on Yuval Noah, I have 4 quadrants in which I divide different people who Russell has interviewed based on religion versus atheism, but then their moral superiority versus a sense of moral equality. And in that, I find that Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro have actually much more in common based on their sense of moral superiority than either has with, say, Yanis Varoufakis, who also identifies as an atheist, but who believes that all people have an equal capacity to govern themselves. And so that's, I think, an example of that sense of moral equality. I think that Sebastian has a more complex view of it. In one of his statements, he says that Republicans and Democrats are equally corrupt, but the Democrats are more coy about it. I think there is a coyness to his sense of superiority in identifying with the liberals and saying that liberals tend to be more egalitarian. In my last episode, What Emerges from the Emergency, I talk about how liberals tend to be professionals and academics who are not threatened, their jobs are not going to be threatened by immigrants, whereas Republicans and conservatives are more often the white working class whose jobs will be threatened by immigrants. And so in both cases, I think we need to look at the roots of whether we are letting capitalism run amok and then taking responsibility for cleaning up their mess rather than challenging the very basis of what's wreaking that kind of havoc. So let's look now at religion and whether religion has deviated from its scriptures. Sebastian talks about how he respects the Christian scriptures, but feels that the practice of Christianity has gone far afield from them. In other things, like economics, what Russell has stated, with which I agree, is that how things are working is exactly the way that they were designed to work. And applying that Occam's razor to something, that the most obvious explanation is the most likely to be true, I think we can also apply that to religion and to politics as democracy. That democracy and Christianity are, I believe, both working exactly the way they were designed to, which is to support the empire and to give us a way of thinking that we have control and participation and that things are designed that way. But in my opinion, the phrase Jesus Christ is an oxymoron. It's two opposite concepts that are joined. The concept of Jesus is that God loved one person above all the rest of us, and better than all the rest of us put together, and then required the sacrifice of that one person in order to forgive all the rest of us. That is very opposite from the Christ mind, the idea that we are one, that we have that inner being, and that there is no logical way that God could love one more than all the rest of us, because we are only one. So if you believe in one, you can't believe in the other. And a God who loves unequally is, I believe, a monster. I think we would be better off being atheists and believing that there is no God rather than believing in that God. Sebastian also talks about how monotheism came out of agriculture, that when people were in larger groups, they no longer had the tribal affinities and the moral code to behave well to one another. And so instead, this morality of how to treat the other came about. Now, David Graeber, in his book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, let me bring that over, talks about how all the religions of altruism came about the same time as the invention of coinage, or what he calls the coinage conquest slavery complex, aka capitalism. That when you ended up with these systems of greed, you needed to have religions of altruism to balance them out. And so neither one was needed if you had a system of reciprocity, which is what was apparent in smaller groups. Sebastian also talks about how the story of the Good Samaritan as an example of a moral code preceded the Bible, something that he's gotten from Christopher Hitchens. I talk in another episode about how the Good Samaritan is like saying the moderate Muslim. It's the exception that proves the rule. And so by saying that there was a Good Samaritan, you are saying that all the rest weren't. In the story, there is someone who helps a person who's been robbed. And so the word rob or robber comes from robe, that at that time they were in revolt, Samaria was, as a colony against the Empire of Rome. And so what they would do is waylay these wealthy people who were wearing the robes of authority that had been given to them by the empire. By taking their robes, they became like any other person. And so the Samaritan, who helps that person maybe helps them because they're rich, because they're Roman, but not something that they would do for just anyone. It's not necessarily an example of altruism and solidarity with the other people who are oppressed. And in the case of democracy, is it something that has been corrupted from its origins, or is it working exactly the way it was designed? I look in my book at the origins of democracy and how at that time the slaves, the colonies, the smallholders, and the landless were rebelling against the archons being the rulers. The anarchists were those who wanted to rule themselves without the rulers. Instead, what they got through democracy was hierarchy, the inheritance order of the archons. They got stepping stones so that they could, by aiding the military with their wealth, the small landowners could also become more wealthy and become part of the assembly and become a part of that voice in their democracy. So all of that negated women. Women didn't even exist in that hierarchy. What I'm looking at is a way that we can design a feminine economy, one that serves the interest of home and family. When I look at Sebastian talking about women and how they tend to have more lateral, more horizontal structures and relationships, I think that is a beautiful thing to be recognizing and to be supporting. It often happens that when I'm thinking about an idea, I reach out my hand and something related falls into it. Last night, I reached for Octavia Butler's Lilith's Brood. And in it, there has been a humanicide. All of humanity has been wiped out except for a few who were saved by aliens. These aliens are covered with tentacles, and one of them explains to Lilith what happened and how two strengths that humans had combined turned into a fatal flaw. Those two strengths are intelligence and hierarchy. If they had only one, it would have made them more resilient, but the two put together were fatal. In it, they start a new interbreeding between women and this species that has no hierarchy. I think that for our solutions, we need to consider something radically different. We have had 100 generations of economic, religious, and political systems that are patriarchal and hierarchical, which is redundant. Those two things are how masculinity expresses itself under empire. In order to head in a different direction, I think we need to consider all of those systems that put women and children at the center, in the way that you would have a tribe where they're not pushing grandma and their wives and children in front to use them as shields, but rather gathering them in the center and serving that as a society. I think that's true also at the smallest level of society, at the family. When I listened to Revelation, I think it was, Russell talks about the night before he gets married and thinking about the vows that he's going to make and what a changed person he needs to be in order to live up to that. I think that what he was considering is pledging himself in service to Laura, who then in turn is in service to the children. None of that means to be a servant to. If we're interdependent, merely interdependent, then what we give up is something that makes us less. It's something that we sacrifice, the way that Sebastian talks about those who are willing to make sacrifices for others. But if we are interbeing, then what we give is what we have. It's what cannot be taken away because we give it freely. I think we need to be considering entirely new social, political, and spiritual structures in which we are in service to the family, to the feminine, to the community. Thank you. If you enjoyed this, here's another one that you might like too, and here is a playlist that continues this theme. And I would love it if you would subscribe. Thank you.